Franklin Roosevelt had been watching Theodore Roosevelt and thinking, you know, I could be president someday. I'm as smart as Uncle Ted. I'm as popular as Uncle Ted. If he could be president, so can I. So he was watching Uncle Ted and watching how the enthusiasm for the war against Spain fizzled out, and how the American people turned against the whole notion of expansion that the war against Spain was premised on. Franklin Roosevelt watched Woodrow Wilson very closely because he was a member of Woodrow Wilson's executive branch. Franklin Roosevelt became Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same position that Theodore Roosevelt had held. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt modeled his own political career on Uncle Ted's political career. And not just his political career. Theodore Roosevelt had had 6 children. And when Franklin Roosevelt married Eleanor Roosevelt, he told Eleanor, and we're going to have 6 kids too. And Eleanor said, what do you mean, we? Who do you think is going to have these kids? But they did have 6 children. And Theodore Roosevelt followed, Franklin Roosevelt followed Theodore Roosevelt's model. He served in the Wilson administration as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he watched very closely how Woodrow Wilson summoned, cultivated popular political support for the war, and he watched how that support persisted throughout the war despite the rising toll of casualties. But then he watched that support finally fizzle away during the peace conference after the war, and he saw Woodrow Wilson's final defeat on the Treaty of Versailles, so that he could see that as of 1920, by 2 years after the war, Americans mostly thought we never should have gotten into that war. And Franklin Roosevelt watched that, and he thought about that, and he thought, if I ever become president, I'm going to do a better job than Uncle Ted. I'm going to do a better job than President Wilson. Now, it just so happened that Franklin Roosevelt found himself President of the United States in the 1930s. He was elected in 1932. For the first 5 years of his presidency, through his whole first term and into his second term, he was mostly a domestic president. But in his second term, as the world began to descend into the Second World War, he realized that the United States was going to have to take some action. That it simply could not stand aside and see Hitler conquer Europe. The United States could not stand aside and see the Japanese government overrun East Asia. But he also knew that he was going to have a very difficult time persuading the American people to agree to intervention in Europe or intervention in Asia, because he saw how American support for Uncle Ted's war against Spain had fizzled. He saw how American support for Woodrow Wilson's war had faded. And he knew that if the United States went to war again, it would have to be more than about just defeating Hitler, defeating the Japanese. The only way to justify such a war would be to change American thinking. To change American thinking from this mindset that what happens in other countries really doesn't matter to us. And we can get along just fine letting the world go to hell in its own handbasket. Franklin Roosevelt came to that conclusion early, but he knew perfectly well that he was going to have a hard time convincing Americans. And so he went at it very slowly, very carefully. He understood that wars only work for the United States when they have the support of the American people. And he was determined that before the United States got involved in war again, it must have the support of the American people. In 1937, he uttered his first words suggesting that the United States might have to take some action against foreign aggressors. He used the word quarantine. That's a public health word. That's not a military or a national security word, but he did say that aggression, foreign aggression, is kind of like the outbreak of disease. And what do you do when there's an outbreak of disease? Well, what you try to do is quarantine the people who've been exposed to the disease so the disease can't spread. And it's a fairly innocuous thing. But in fact, the response to this call for a quarantine was sufficiently opposed that Roosevelt backed away. And he didn't even raise the subject for another year. He was very careful, very cautious about this. Well, in the late summer, autumn of 1939, Europe went to war again. Okay, Roosevelt decides that the United States is going to have to get involved. But how to get involved? That was the issue. He didn't ask for neutrality, but he did say we're not going to war. Oh, there was another thing involved here. Roosevelt had decided he was going to run for a third term. No president had ever been elected to 3 terms. There was nothing in the Constitution at this point against it, but nobody had ever done it. George Washington had set the 2-term rule, and Roosevelt was going to try to break that rule. Why? Well, like other politicians, he was ambitious and he wanted to serve longer. But also because he believed that, and this is the commonest thing among people who think they ought to be President of the United States, he was convinced that he was the best person to lead the United States during this time of crisis. And so he knew perfectly well that if he said to Americans, hey, re-elect me and I'm taking you to war, it's no way to run for president. No. You say, re-elect me and I'm going to keep you out of war. And in fact, just days before the election, Franklin Roosevelt said, I will not send American boys to fight in any foreign wars. Okay, this seemed to put him in a bind. He can't send American troops to Europe. Well, there was, not as though he had his fingers crossed behind his back, but there was an unstated exception to this. And that was, what if the United States gets attacked? Then it's not a foreign war, right? Then it's our war. Okay, Roosevelt decided that Hitler needed to be opposed, that the Japanese needed to be opposed. He found one method after another to increase American support for Britain, which at this point was the main country fighting Germany. He sent American destroyers to Britain. He persuaded Congress to pass what's called the Lend-Lease Bill. This just opened the floodgates of American money and American weapons to the countries fighting against Hitler and fighting against the Japanese. And then he organized what amounted to a covert and undeclared naval war against Germany on the Atlantic. And he declared economic war against Japan. But he refused to fire the first shot. He insisted that the United States be attacked, because he knew perfectly well that if the United States fired the first shot, then his opponents, maybe not immediately, but after a while would say, Roosevelt led us into war. For Roosevelt, he understood that the only way that support for this war would be sustained, and the only way he could get this change in American thinking about the war, was for this war not to be Roosevelt's war. Not to be Roosevelt's war the way the war against Spain was Theodore Roosevelt's war, or the First World War was Woodrow Wilson's war, but this war to be America's war.